Needing something to spruce up your front door this summer? Why not make a fun, festive summer wreath using fabric scraps? It's not only super cute, but super easy. First, you're going to need fabric scraps cut 2.5-inch wide. The length doesn't really matter. You will need possibly a glue gun and a foam wreath or a pool noodle. I couldn't find a foam wreath, so I am using a pool noodle. If you are using a pool noodle, you're going to need to take some tape and turn it into a wreath. I used some painter's tape to do this. Next, you're going to take your strips of fabric and sew them together end to end. And then once you've got them all sewn, you're going to press them in half. Again, the length doesn't really matter, but in total I had about 20 yards of these strips once I've sewn them all together. And then you're just simply going to take the long strips of fabric and roll them around the wreath. Again, I'm going to suggest that you actually use a foam wreath versus a pool noodle because I found that during the heat, the noodle starts to sag and loses its shape. Once you get to the end of the wreath, after wrapping it, just use the hot glue gun to glue it in place. And you can also use the hot glue gun to hold that first strip as you start to roll it onto the wreath as well. I took one of the other strips, about a 24-inch long strip, folded it twice, top stitched it so that it didn't have any raw edges, and then basically all I'm doing here is making a loop and hot gluing it to the top so that I can hang the wreath from the door. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some embellishments by making some fabric flowers with some more scraps. So this is again just one of those 2.5-inch wide strips. I'm not sure how long it is. You can play with different length. I'm just using up all the scrap fabrics that I had in coordinating colors. So I did a gathered stitch on one end and I'm just pinking the other end of the strip. Using the gathers that I made, I'm just going to gather up the strip of fabric and kind of rolling it into a spiral as I gather. Once you have the entire fabric strip all gathered, I cut the thread ends, and again I'm kind of turning this into a spiral, and I'm using a hot glue gun simply to hold that spiral in place. And it does take a little fiddling with, and also be careful because I did happen to burn my little fingers with the hot glue gun a couple of times while making these fabric flowers. And finally, once you got that done, I added another little extra embellishment by just using a random stray button or two to create the centers of my fabric flowers. And there you have the fabric flowers. I made a couple of different ones and I just sort of offset them on the wreath and hot glued them in place. And there pretty much is the fabric wreath. I decided after making the fabric wreath that I would also make a little fabric monogram letter to go with it. So I'm doing B for Burris, and basically I just took some cardboard that I had laying around and I printed out the font for the letter, really large print, on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, glue sticked it onto the cardboard, so basically I had a template to cut out, and I just used an Exacto knife to cut out the letter B. And it is a little fiddly. It does take a little bit of time. You don't have to be exact, so don't worry if you've got a little bit of uneven edges. The fabric kind of hides all that. So I only used about 14 yards of that giant strip of fabric that I had created. So I'm taking the other 6 yards, and I don't think I even used all 6 yards on this little monogram B here, but I took whatever I had left, and I basically am doing the exact same thing that I did with the wreath here with the letter B as well, simply going around it. It is a little fiddlier because the letter, and depending on what letter you're doing, you may find it easier or you may find it a little bit more difficult to get the fabric all the way around the letter. I just kind of did the best I could in certain places. As long as you make sure that you have the whole letter covered, I think is more important than the direction that you're twisting and turning around the letter. I did hot glue it in a couple of different places simply to make sure that the fabric didn't slip off the letter. And just like with the wreath, I used a little fabric flower and a fabric tie for the loop. And they're separate pieces, so they just kind of hang within each other, and they're on the front door, and it just adds a little bit of summer festiveness to the front door, and a great way to use up some of those fabric scraps that you have lying around.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Akram's Ideas, and thanks for watching.